and McKinsey's consumer-wise research unpacks some of the underlying motivations and drivers behind these decisions. And today we have the pleasure of hearing from the two global leaders of our consumer-wise capability. And they are two of the co-authors of the State of the Consumer Report. That's Christina Adams, a partner in the Dallas office, and Carrie Aldridge, a partner based in Minneapolis. And I'm going to hand the floor over to them in just a minute. But first, some housekeeping. So Carrie and Christina will be talking through some slides, and that presentation, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be emailed to you afterwards. And we want this webinar to be as useful to you as possible. So please do use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit your questions at any time. We'll try to address them throughout, so there's no need to wait until the Q&A portion. There is a Q&A portion at the end, but no need to wait until then to submit your questions. Only our speakers will see your questions, and they will not be attributed to your company. So, we won't say so-and-so from company X has submitted a question. We will just say what your question is. So we're going to get right into it. But before we dive into the consumer sentiment data, maybe just a high-level question for you, Carrie and Christina, about consumer sentiment data in general, right? Because one of the things that you've observed in the past year or two is a decoupling of consumer sentiment and consumer spending, right? It used to be that the two were fairly in sync. When sentiment was positive, then people spent money. When they weren't feeling so great, then they didn't spend as much money. But that has not been the case recently. So given this divergence, why should companies still pay attention to consumer sentiment? Like, what are the benefits of knowing how consumers are feeling in an era when how they're feeling about the economy or about their finances is increasingly divorced from how they're spending? So I don't know which one of you wants to answer that first.
Yeah, I can jump in. Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Aldridge. Excited to have a chance to share a little bit with you today about our most recent look at what's going on with the consumer around the world. So it is true, Monica, to your point, that at the highest level, consumer confidence, which had been the kind of bellwether marker that has long been looked at to understand how consumers are feeling, and which had correlated quite closely with consumer spending, is less and less correlated. And that's a long-term trend. That's not just over the last 5 years. We actually went back about 20 years and found that over the past 20 years, particularly in the US and in Western Europe, confidence is less and less correlated to spend. That said, that in our minds makes it only more important to understand consumer sentiment at a much more granular and detailed level, because at the highest level, you can't just depend on confidence to say consumers are confident, therefore spending will increase. What we're finding is the need to dig deeper, right? To understand not only consumer confidence, but how they're feeling about other markers, look at it by demographic group, by psychographic or generational group, to really get a layer deeper into how they're feeling and how that drives their behavior. And in addition, that's the other reason that we pulled in, a myriad of different data sources to this report. And we always look at sentiment and behavior together. So behavior, as an example, there's spending data that we can observe. There's, footstep or traffic data. There's digital data around how consumers are spending their time, where the eyeballs are. So we're always bringing that 360-degree view of the consumer, and that's, fueling much of what you'll see here today.
Christina, did you want to address that?
I think Carrie summarized it well.
Yeah,
I will say it is both the granularity of information we're bringing, the granularity of questions we're asking. The other thing we have observed is there are different drivers of why people say they are confident or are lacking confidence. And those different drivers, some of them macroeconomic, some of them based on pricing and inflation, some of them based on COVID when that was big, those have different impacts on how people react. And then certainly different people are reacting differently. And we'll see I'll speak about in more detail as we get into it, but Gen Z is reacting quite differently than other generations. And so again, that nuance does really come through, hopefully, in how we're seeing these trends and how companies should react to them.
Right. And that's probably one of the big takeaways later on, right? Companies needing this 360-degree view of the consumer. And we'll talk more about what that means a little bit later. But let's get into the 5 trends. And for each of these trends, it would be super helpful if you'd present the data, but also give us your insights into what's behind the data, right? What are the sort of underlying drivers of the trend? And the first trend sounds kind of depressing, right? People are spending more time alone and online, but maybe you'll give some nuance to this and it's not as dire as it sounds. So Carrie, over to you.
Yeah. So when we started this work, we thought it was a really interesting moment, 5 years out from the pandemic, to think about what the meaningful and sustaining impact of that global, pandemic or crisis might be on consumers as we go forward. We thought 5 years was, enough time, for these trends to either have returned to some version of normal or to have become ingrained in consumer behavior and become sticky. And this one for us was one that was just, it really is a remarkable shift if you think about it in terms of the way that consumers are people, right, are spending their time. And in fact, that behavior that many of us developed during the pandemic, where we had no choice but to be online and alone, really has persisted. And the statistic here, was one for me that was pretty remarkable. Consumers report, and this is pretty universal across demographic groups and globally. Consumers report that they have an extra 3 hours of free time in their week, and that has arisen because of things originally like remote work and online shopping, but because many of those behaviors have persisted, at least at some level, hybrid work or online work, less commuting, more online shopping, et cetera. Consumers have gained real time in their week. That is a meaningful amount of time. And so we were so interested to understand, what are consumers doing with that time? And in fact, nearly all of it is being spent online and alone, in a myriad of different activities. So everything from, hobbies and self-interest, many of which are online, fitness, some of which is also online, shopping, relaxing, listening to music. But if you think about your own families, you might find that instead of families sitting together in the evening, even watching TV, even if they were looking at a screen, now it could be that, mom is in the kitchen shopping online, dad is, in his office, working remotely, and the kids each take their laptop to the bedroom center, streaming, Netflix or gaming alone, right? So that's the behavior. I think that in terms of what the implications are for companies and consumer-facing companies in particular, the first one is pretty obvious, and that is, meeting consumers where they are. You see the middle statistic here that, 80% of consumers, again, this is pretty universal around the world, have shopped online or an online-only retailer in the last month. 90+% of consumers in the US and China, have this behavior. So, you really need to think about your online presence and how you're showing up online. There are other more subtle implications, though, that I think are important for companies to consider. The first is this notion of immediate gratification, which we all came to expect during the pandemic. We want to be able to order something and have it show up immediately. So thinking about ways to reduce barriers and friction, consumers are expecting immediate gratification and convenience. You see this nearly 20% year-on-year growth in food delivery, over the 5 years since the pandemic, which, is really an explosion of a behavior that was pretty nascent prior to 2020. So thinking about your online presence, thinking about reducing friction and barriers, thinking about, always available, always on. And then, lastly, particularly for retailers and other experiential consumer facing companies, I think thinking about things like gamification is really critical. Because consumers are, expecting that level of engagement online. So whether it's gamification of your loyalty program or other ways, to be engaging with consumers, meeting them where they are. That's really what we're seeing coming out of this trend.
Do you have an example of that, Carrie? How are people gamifying? How are companies gamifying?
Yeah, I think the best examples that I've seen, and then, Christina, welcome you chiming in here, but the best examples that I've seen are in loyalty programs, so whether it's a D2C retailer or even brick and mortar retailer who makes achieving the next level of status a bit of a game. You can earn points, you see a leaderboard, you maybe get badges for different, activities on their site or in their stores. So that's kind of the best example I've seen. Christina, I don't know if you've seen others.
I think that's a great example. I will say that I think I also saw a question that asked about if behaviors are shifting fully online or if there is still an omni-channel existence of both. And I do see that some of that, as you said, Carrie, gamification, but also some of the interaction online then drives in-store behavior. And we do still see people doing both. So certainly, there is a growing percentage of online only shopping, but by far and away the majority is still omni, where it could be discovery online or participation online, but then still purchasing in store. But a lot of that dynamic forms of interaction is what creates some of that interplay between the two. So we are seeing that remain an important strategy for brands.
And there are some questions that I think, speak to a little bit of the tension between this trend and another one later on. So maybe we'll move on to the second trend.
Yes, this is one of those great paradoxes that we see in the data. So while it is true that consumers, are increasingly online and alone, they're using a lot of their free time to engage online. Many of them report that they are, as Christina said, discovering and researching products online, and much of that learning happens on social media, as you see here. It is also true that social media is the least trusted source of information for consumers. And again, that is true pretty much around the world and pretty much across age and income groups, with a little bit of a difference in China. So it's a stark paradox, and by a factor of, close to 10, right? So most trusted source for information by consumers, and again, this is largely true across geographies, is friends and family. Least trusted source of information is social media, and in particular, influencers on social media. I think, consumers increasingly know that many of those influencers are paid. They also know or believe that many of them aren't even real, right? So if you look at the world of beauty or fashion, they understand that many of those images or, things that they see are AI driven or generated. So they're increasingly distrustful of that information. That said, they're still using it to learn about products and then, making their own decisions based on other sources of information. I think for us, and for many of my clients as they grapple with what to do about this, it does raise the importance of an omni strategy that Christina was starting to talk about. So, I think re-looking at traditional media, frankly, which is a much more trusted source, ironically, than social media, thinking about the allocation of your marketing budgets across channels, critically important. And then in-store tactics, are still very, very important in an omni shopping world. So thinking about, in-store promotions and experiential ways that consumers can touch, see, feel your product. That's a really important tactic as well.
Yeah, so one of the questions here is about distrust on digital channels, and increasing ad spend on the same channels don't really go hand in hand, right? So what are some specific insights that marketers should be aware of in this world?
Yeah. So I think the thing I would say is I don't believe that marketers' budgets have caught up with where consumers' heads are at. So when we did this research just a year ago, this picture looked different. And social media was a more trusted source of information for many consumers. So these numbers are moving quickly is my first observation. The second thing I would say is that the great thing about digital is that it's a closed loop and you can know whether it's working or not, in large part. And so I would encourage marketers to be doing more granular research to understand the ROI of their digital spend. And then finally, I would be thinking more broadly about allocation of spend and potentially shifting away from some of the social. So social commerce is still critically important. Just to be clear, social commerce is still critically important. People are buying products through social commerce. What has shifted is consumers' trust in social media and influencers on social media as a source of truth or information about the products that they buy. So it is a complicated question for marketers.
Yeah, thanks for, sorry, go ahead, Christina.
No, I'm sorry. I would just also add that there's a lot of granularity and nuance in it. The other major trend that has shifted in the last year, as Carrie was talking about, is the rise of AI. And the rise of AI has led to a lot of content being created where consumers, and particularly younger consumers, have some inherent sort of skepticism. So it's awareness, but verify. So there are certainly still some established, trusted influencers who play a role that remains relevant, and I think even relevant in complement to what a brand might say themselves. But just as Carrie said, the message of any influencer, anytime being better, it is not the sort of universal thing being upheld now as it might have been a year ago.
Are you finding, and there's some questions here about that, are you finding that there are categories where influencers work really well or categories where they just are not effective? Or is it not a category thing?
I think it's even more nuanced than that. I mean, certainly there are categories where influencers play a bigger role, things like beauty, things like fashion, things like fitness, things like health, as opposed to, for example, maybe core center of store, grocery. So there are places where influencers, I think, do play a bigger role just naturally because there are things that consumers are, more engaged with in social channels. I think to Christina's point, it's the granularity of understanding, which influencers, are trusted and what sort of content consumers, will view as being authentic and not fake and trusted. So you have to get 2 or 3 or 4 layers deeper, I think, than saying they work better in some categories than others.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of questions, but let's move on to the third trend because some of the questions also do apply to the third and fourth and fifth trends. So go ahead, Christina.
Very good. Absolutely. And maybe I'll just start. We've already started touching on Gen Z, which only emphasize that Gen Z as a generation is here. They are established. They are fast growing and fast changing. Importantly, this is a critical moment in time. The average age for Gen Z is now 22. They range from 15 to 29. Since last year, there's been a 45% increase in Gen Z who say they're married, a 23% increase in those with children. And now 19% of Gen Z are in decision-making roles at work. So again, as we think about this generation, they are fast taking shape and fast, frankly, gaining spending power. They view money differently than some generations before them. They care a lot about financial security, but they are still willing to splurge and to splurge quite a bit more than generations before them. And we don't see any sign of that slowing down. I would say we are seeing some habitual shifts in areas that prior generations considered big investments, home purchase, things like that, look a bit different for Gen Z. Gen Z is investing quite a bit in experiences. The Taylor Swift Eras Tour, I think, is a great example of spending and what that looked like and willingness to invest in areas like that. But also investing in micro experiences. So willing to pay for the cup of coffee that sort of brings them joy at the beginning of the day, or willing to invest in nutrition, which they view as important. I'd also seen a question earlier asking about some different markets, maybe to just bring a little bit of data. Overall, across all the countries we survey, there are 18. Gen Z, on average, 65% of them say they are willing to splurge in the categories that matter to them to splurge. And that ranges from about the lowest being about 50% in markets like South Korea, all the way up to 85% in India, with all countries landing between those. But across every single country, Gen Z was the highest splurging generation. And so we do see that as an important factor. And we see the other theme you'll continue to see as we talk about these trends is nuance. There is real nuance. Nutrition and wellness matters to Gen Z, but unlike earlier generations, where I'll use the term fad diets, but even organic, natural tended to emerge most. Protein is actually one of the single top things that Gen Z talks about. And so there's a specificity that's quite important. That's not to say the others don't matter, but it is a little bit of a different shape than prior generations. And then the other thing is Gen Z does use AI more. They are skeptical of AI, but they are also aware that it is there and they engage with it. So we are seeing some brands actually use AI tools to interface with consumers. That is reaching Gen Z in a very effective way. But one of the biggest things is just coming back to this idea of having important granular insights on the motivators of Gen Z, and particularly motivators on where they're choosing to spend and how they're choosing to spend.
One of the questions here is, where does Gen Z learn about brands and what motivates them to go into a store? Any insights in that?
A lot of the learning is online. So this comes back to where the difference between trust and awareness, which is, I think, an important nuance. So awareness certainly is driven by online. Peer-to-peer recommendations and direct knowledge from people is also very important. Gen Z tend to connect with each other. And so this idea of, it's still an influencer, but it's an influencer that is quite literally someone that you know and trust directly, is also a big thing that we are seeing. Carrie, I don't know if there's anything you would add.
No, that's right. Research online, awareness, but most trusted source for this generation, like all the other generations, is friends and family. Now, that might not be speaking directly to friends and family. It might come through a social media connection with that friends and family. But that is still the most trusted source for this generation.
And as we're talking about Gen Z, somebody asked a question about, why are millennials second priority? Aren't they a cohort with larger incomes and larger decision-making influence and more disposable income? Why are we talking about Gen Z all the time? What is the answer to that?
It is a good question, and it is not, I am also a millennial. I will speak on behalf of the generation that it is not, it is certainly not a forgotten generation. It is still the highest spending generation at this moment in time. That being said, millennial behavior at this point looks more similar to Gen X and even to some boomer. Boomer is a bit different, but it is more known, established, and it is less quickly changing than Gen Z behavior. And so this is around getting ahead. And I should note, I think I saw a question clarifying the data I quoted was the change in Gen Z that are married or have children. It is not the absolute. So it is still a relatively small number that fit that. But again, it is so Gen Z are the increase in Gen Z parents every year is very large and will continue to be very large as they change and take shape. And so because they are in a highly malleable point, and when they reach a critical age are expected to be bigger spenders than millennials, it is about understanding them with that nuance and preparing, but certainly not losing sight of millennial and Gen X, but also boomers who are the second largest spending generation at this point.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons that I'm super interested in Gen Z, and I know that many of my clients are as well, is that they are in their kind of formational stage, right? Where they are developing, preferences, learning about brands. And so it's a really important time to engage, with this generation. I think there is also, though, a real sense, and we're seeing it in the data, that they might not grow up to look like previous generations, for example, millennials did. It is that they were shaped differently, right? If you think about this generation, they were, the children, the college students, that were most impacted, by the pandemic. And I think that is likely to have, lasting implications for them in lots of ways. And one way that we do see it is this prioritizing of experiences over things. And that shows up in willingness to splurge. It also shows up just in what they value. And there are ways, I think, for companies to think, even companies that make things, to think about how do they make their thing an experience or surround their thing with an experience. And I'll give you an example of that. I was recently in China and I was doing some work in the sweet indulgence category. So think, confectionery, other sweet indulgences. And what we found is that, for companies that have physical products, call it candy, confection, sweet, drink, or, sweet treat, dessert type items, the ones that are growing the fastest, and particularly, among this generation, are the ones that are whatever the Chinese version of Instagram. I know it's not Instagram, but the ones that are sort of worthy of being shared in social media, right? So this confection, creation is so amazing. Even though I'm buying a thing and the thing costs twice as much as, a similar thing, because it is so beautiful and the way that it is presented is such an experience that I want to post that and share that and make that an experience. I am willing to spend double the amount. And that was really eye-opening to me, and a great example of how a company that makes a physical product can actually capitalize on this notion of Gen Z being so interested in spending and splurging, especially on experiences.
Yeah, so just say a little bit more about the splurge, because one of the questions, or a bunch of the questions, are about buy now, pay later, which is something that's mentioned in the report, and Gen Z's affinity for that type of payment plan. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with just splurging in general and then touch on that. So I think there were also some questions on when we say splurging, what do we mean? And the reality is it is different for different consumers. The places that Gen Z most over indexes versus other generations in splurging is around dining decisions. So where they are eating away from home or the types of groceries they are eating, beauty and personal care, and then entertainment broadly. And so it does tend to be more experiential or in the moment type decisions versus necessarily, as you might see for other generations, house or car or other sort of large purchases like that. And buy now, pay later is a part of it. We are still seeing the biggest ways they are thinking about splurging and decision making is still just, again, because they're not the huge decisions. It is just that they invest. They will invest in the cup of coffee that they want to drink, or they will invest in the type of food that they want to eat. However, we are seeing a comfort with different types of economic decisions. And I think that comes from being in a time of, relatively high interest rates and a fast moving economy, particularly in the US, but also globally, that is resulting in some willingness to accept some risks there. But I would say it is a real portion of Gen Z decisions, but it is not as large as some of the everyday splurges that are happening on products and behaviors. But Carrie,
They're in it. Yeah, they're an interesting dichotomy as a generation. So while they are more likely to define themselves based on financial security and career success, as you see here on the page, it's also something like 90%, Christina, you might know the number, of Gen Z in the US don't have enough savings to cover even 1 month worth of expenses, right? So they're living beyond their means in large part, even though they say that they are defining themselves, based on financial security and career success more than, marriage or love or family formation or friendships. So that's an interesting dichotomy. And I think that's part of what drives the buy now, pay later phenomenon too, right? If you don't have enough in savings to cover even next month's worth of expenses, but you really want to splurge or value, this thing, that's one way to get it. They also are making quite a bit more money, and I think this was an interesting statistic for me, than boomers were at their same age, even when you account for cost of living and inflation. So they're making more money than previous generations did at their age. They care about financial security, but they also aren't saving. So you really have to dig into to understand what money means to them and how they're willing to spend it.
Right. And maybe just one more question on that, and then we'll move on to the next trend. But there's a bunch of questions about sustainability and Gen Z, right? Speaking of contradictions, right? They say sustainability is important to them, but are they really willing to spend on sustainable products? So what does the survey or the research show on that?
It matters, and there are aspects of it that. And I actually would say sustainability is certainly better for the environment, but we also see things like our companies doing the right thing and role of DEI, et cetera, matter. And Gen Z talk about how they matter, absolutely. But it is true that in this moment in time, we are not seeing the investment level behind it fully account for what it costs companies to do it. Of course, we would. It's a tricky dichotomy because, of course, it is the right thing for businesses to be doing to consider that. That being said, it is important not to yet assume that the dollars will follow if that comes at a premium price. So while it matters, it is one that it is still not at a place where it can be priced for.
And it also, all the other things also matter to this generation, like immediate gratification, like, availability online, like home delivery, so it matters, but they also want everything else that they want. The other thing that's interesting when you dig into what's important to them, the most frequent way that they describe it is it's consistent with my values, right? And I think it's important to remember this is a generation that is not monolithic, and what is consistent with my values is individual to that person, right? So really understanding for your category, for your product, what are the values? Is it Is it global climate change? Is that the value? Is it, animal welfare? Is that the value? Is it, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is that the value? But really understanding when they say it's consistent with my values, what does that mean to your consumer?
And that's actually a good segue to the next trend. So, or the fifth trend, I suppose. Who's talking about this one? Local brands.
Of course. So a couple things here, and I'll hit this and I can hit the next one relatively efficiently. But buying local matters. It was pointed out earlier that there is a tension between the online shopping and the buying local. And so a couple things on that. One, it matters to 47% of people. So that is a lot, but it is certainly not 90% of people. But it does matter. And the increase of how it is mattering is growing. So that 47%, when you look at the EU5, that number is 52%. And I should also clarify, I think sometimes as a US consumer, we talk local, and local can mean like the farmer's market on the corner. While that certainly can be a trend, this really means domestic as we think about local purchases. Some of the reasons this is evolving are a few things. So one, certainly tariffs and conversations about tariffs, that going both ways. So thinking about wanting security of products you are purchasing, not worrying about if major price changes might be ahead. I think there's other legislation that we have not yet fully dived into to understand, but will by our next quarterly report. But that only increases the uncertainty that consumers have. A couple of countries that particularly are increasing a lot, when you compare Q2 of this year versus Q1, the preference for domestic products in the US increased 4%. In Canada, increased 8%. That one has a high correlation to the US and expectations of what's happening in the US. And then in China, increased 7%. So another big trade partner with the US, obviously. And so as we think about this and what companies are doing, this is a place where certainly messaging where there are domestic or locally made products that already exist is relevant, but it also can inform M&A strategies as companies consider either partnerships or acquisitions that create access within a country's borders for products.
A few people are asking whether there are specific categories in which local brands matter more.
Yeah, it's one that it's valuable to understand overall. As consumers talk about it, they do think about it across the board. We did see some categories, particularly on large purchases, electronics, automotives, et cetera, where consumers were even more concerned because the same percentage price change would look like a much higher absolute dollar number. And so there was some more concern in some of the bigger ticket items. That being said, we even see a concern around food, beverage, personal care items that are not large, but they may be purchased on a regular basis and just wanting to establish routines. Again, though, I would take this as an important trend to understand and a trend that we are seeing evolving, but still not something, it is still roughly half of consumers that are being shaped by this. And again, just to paint the picture, the concern ranges up to the high 60s in countries like India, Mexico, but down to the sort of 30s and 40s, particularly in some of the smaller European countries and Japan. So it is a range that's important to get into that granularity of detail.
Great. Okay. And the fifth trend, I'm conscious of somebody else is conscious of time, saying, can we get to the fifth trend? Go ahead.
Absolutely. So value equation, this one ties to a lot of what we've been talking about. And it is important to note that we do think of this as value, not just price. And that is an important dynamic as we think about this. However, as prices have continued to rise and as inflation remains a relevant topic, we see consumers defining value in a new way. It is consistently, the two of the top three concerns that consumers are talking about are price, inflation, tariff related. And we are seeing trade down behavior continue. And I say that with full recognition that trade down is an interesting juxtaposition to what we talked about earlier with splurging. And often we see the same consumer doing both. It is a matter of in which categories they're doing it. So they will trade down in certain categories to enable splurging in others. And the importance of understanding the consumer holistically is to understand the occasions and needs that are driving the difference between those behaviors. I will also say, though, that when we look at trade down, the top ways consumers talk about trade down is first that they will look to purchase the same product, but they will purchase a smaller size or a lower quantity of it. That is juxtaposed to sort of the 2008 economic setback where private label was the top way that consumers were trading down. It is certainly still a way that consumers are trading down, but consumers are more looking to preserve behavior, but just do it at a lower absolute price point. And then consumers are also changing channels in which they shop. And so they are willing to make decisions based on enabling the potential for lower price points on the same product. And you therefore see consumers, going back to the point of omnichannel, shopping in more places to achieve that portfolio. And all this points to revenue management or revenue growth management as an important consideration, particularly in thinking about price pack architecture and thinking about channel strategy, and just overall the dynamic ability to reach consumers with a price point that reflects the value that they're seeing in the product.
I think one of the
Right,
most
so-
interesting, sorry, just a thought here, Monica, and I know we're running short on time. One of the most interesting new trends that we're seeing is this this trade-off across categories as opposed to just within categories. So it was one of the first times in the data that we had seen consumers saying that they were trading down on essential items to enable them to splurge on discretionary items. In past economic times of economic challenge, you tended to see the opposite, right? So people cutting back on discretionary things. So I'm not going to go on that trip this summer, or I'm not going to buy, as many new clothes for my kids for back to school because I need to spend on essentials, things like, food and, personal care. And this reverse that we're seeing now, like I'm going to trade down on essentials, right? So I might buy private label in food or in personal care to enable me to splurge on that discretionary item, whether it's, I want to go to that concert or I want to go on that trip this summer. So really starting to understand those cross-category choices consumers are making, I think is a pretty different muscle for many companies who have been pretty grounded in their own categories and thinking about value as, bounded within their category.
Right. And maybe just spend a minute on the implications. You've already started to touch on them, right? Like 360-degree view, RGM, et cetera, but maybe say a little bit more about what companies can do with this data.
Yeah. And so first I'll say, we're happy to follow up on any of these topics, obviously. Second, there's lots more detail in the report, which is available on McKinsey.com, as Monica said. And we have touched on many of these throughout our conversation. I think we've talked a lot about nuance and getting deeper to understand some of these paradoxical choices that consumers are making and how things look different across generations. So I think we've covered that one pretty well. Christina just talked a little bit about our RGM, which we talk about as revenue growth management. It's the set of levers or tools companies can use to think about pricing holistically across, pricing, package size, pack architecture, promotion, and even assortment, how they show up with what product lines, both in store and online. So, getting much more nuanced in that discipline is important given the way consumers are making these trade-offs and choices. I think portfolio shaping, so whether that's mergers and acquisitions or divestitures, so reshaping your portfolio to lean into those places where there is growth, both by geography, by consumer segment, by category. That's something we, see companies thinking a lot about. And then finally, the technology to support all of this. We didn't talk a lot about technology, but a couple of important places where we're seeing that show up is in innovation. So using AI, for example, as a way to more quickly develop product concepts and innovate and get products to market, using AI to create marketing content, and then all of the analytics required to understand the ROI of that marketing investment, are ways that we're seeing companies invest in response to these trends and changes. So I'll leave it there. I know we're at time.
Yes, thank you so much all for being such an engaged audience. There were tons of questions, but you will get a recording of the webinar after this, and please feel free to share it with your colleagues. And if we didn't get to your question, or if you'd like to discuss the research in more detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to Carrie and Christina. Their contact info is on the slide, and they would be happy to engage with you and to continue the conversation. So thank you again, and we hope you'll join us at the next Consumer and Retail webinar. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.